Welcome to Brand Australia 2025. I'm Tim Winkler from Future Campus. My colleague Stephen Matchett is at the end there. We will go through our speakers in just a moment. But I just wanted to introduce you a little to the conference and the reason why we thought it was a really important topic to talk about today. Before we do that, I want to start by recognising that we're meeting on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I want to also go a step further and say that we welcome being able to acknowledge country here. And we also wanted to go a step further and look at Indigenous culture in general and involve Professor Marie Meredith, who's out the front here. I'd like to acknowledge her collaboration in putting this conference together, because we've thought it's time to not just have our journalistic voices in, but also have voices from the sector in shaping the types of events that we have and the types of conversations that we want to have. So that's certainly something that we'll be aiming to do further on into the future, and thanks very much to Marie for helping to get this day together. I also wanted to recognise the extraordinary group of speakers who we have today. It's really gratifying that so many people are committed to this conversation about social licence and how we can better connect with Middle Australia. Wanted to acknowledge Ant Bagshaw from the ATN group of universities who's provided some really valuable advice along the way, and also ATN is sponsoring the networking drinks afterwards as part of our partnership with them. That's from 4 till 5:30 in the courtyard afterwards. Lunch is going to be at 1:30, but if you're absolutely famished, it's possible that the food will have arrived at about 1, so feel free to duck out, but do come back very quickly because Bill Shorten's coming for a keynote speech at 1 o'clock sharp, and he's got a very tight time frame, so we want to maximise time with him. But we're really looking forward to meeting and spending more time with you through the day. In terms of the rules of the day, we like to keep things fast and friendly, so we're hoping to get you engaged in the conversation as we go, as well as hear from our fabulous panels. Then when we bring around the microphone, if you just raise your hand, we'll bring the microphone to you. And if you can ask questions rather than make statements, that would be really awesome, so we can maximise the value of our panels. Now, social licence is a really significant issue. I was thinking about it last night. There's a little story that I thought I would share with you, which my grandfather was a manufacturer of bicycles. He lived in Geelong. And in about 1950, he thought he might join the Freemasons. At the time, he didn't know much about it because they were a little known organisation, but at the time they were quite a thriving organisation that did a lot of philanthropic work around the community. But he went along and they asked him to take an oath. I don't know whether this is a thing of general to Freemasons or peculiar to the local branch, but they asked him to take an oath that he would cut out his tongue and have it buried in burning sand afterwards if he gave away any secrets of the Freemasons. And then after that, they asked him to ride a goat around the hall as the sort of the initiation protocol, and he never subsequently joined the Freemasons. It's an interesting analogy. It's a story which has become quite a thing in our family. But when you look at the membership relatively of the Freemasons now, an organisation set up to do great things for the community. If you think about their interest in wearing unusual regalia for ceremonial occasions and having their own form of language and their own initiation processes, there's similarities between perhaps what we do and what they did in the past. So where are we in the world of social licence and what the community think? We know that last year The federal government attempted to introduce caps on international students, saying that there was a diminished social licence for universities. The Coalition have warmed to that theme, taking it further, and saying that universities are out of step with Middle Australia and the issues that are across the kitchen table. The problem with the conversation is that while there are a couple of studies, there is nothing really to show us exactly how much, why, and how social licence has changed in Middle Australia overall. There's a couple of small studies, but nothing which would stand up. There's undoubtedly private polling which is showing that that could be the case, but we don't have a public reference on how to fix it. That's why we've decided to start the day with the People's Panel, with people who really understand others. Now, as part of our process, I could read you out the bios of each of our speakers, but it would take some time. So I will instead do a relatively informal introduction and say that Michelle Grattan is a national treasure. I started out as a journalist many years ago, and she was already famous in Australia then, and she remains a great icon of journalism in Australia, and also someone who knows what's going on. So we're delighted to have her here. Frank Bongiorno shows why history is relevant. He has a great talent to cut through and remind us why historians have a key role in our society still, even though that's sometimes forgotten. And Jodie Trembath is worked in a range of roles in the sector, but now is working with the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And we are delighted to have you here. So thank you very much. Michelle, can we start with you? Can you give us your thoughts on where social licence has gone wrong, if it has gone wrong, and why we're hearing these messages?
Thanks very much. Can everyone hear all right? Yeah. Well, look, I think one factor to take into account is that universities have changed over the decades quite dramatically. They've gone from being relatively small elite institutions with their students coming from predominantly from only a section, the more affluent section of the population, not a great proportion of the population, to being much more accessible and comprehensive. And in that process, they've also become more commercialised. We now have them providing one of the major export industries of the country. And I think that also the student population has changed and in the process become more demanding of universities and see them in a different sort of way. It's been a transformation almost from institutions of learning, of places where you get a general education, even though that might be quite specialised in a field, to institutions that a lot of those attending them regard as sort of academic supermarkets. And so the students these days spend less time on campus. They're more likely to combine their learning with a lot of work, commercial work, and therefore and of course they're paying very substantial fees for courses, and therefore they are much more demanding of these institutions, much more critical of the sort of education they get if they regard it as not satisfactory, and the institutions are really on notice because their students are consumers as much as learners. At the same time, I think that governments have become much more interventionist with universities. They're critical of them on various levels. Obviously, the export industry is tied into the whole migration debate. At another level, you get governments who regard universities as part of the culture wars. So get an inquiry, for example, a few years ago into freedom of speech on campuses. And also you get governments feeling that these institutions can't necessarily properly manage their own campuses, really. So you get concern about things like sexual harassment and assault and what happens on campus. So in general, I think you've had this great transformation of the sector and how it's regarded, and that has made it more difficult for it to have and maintain its social licence.
Frank, you've studied history and politics. How are you concerned that the attitude towards the sector is becoming more politically partisan, as it has been in the US?
Yeah, I guess the whole campus wars, culture wars thing is a problem, as I think Michelle's already hinted. And you know, this is a part, I think, also of a broader sense of mismatch that I think Michelle was also talking about there between, I guess, public expectations of the core business of universities and in some ways what universities have always been and what they'll probably continue to be. So that is, I reckon if you asked, you know, most parents, for instance, most members of the public, what they would see as the core business of university, it would basically be about education of domestic undergraduate students, right? Now, as we know, universities actually do a whole range of other things. They are also a really important part of civil society, and I think because they're an important part of civil society, they're subject, if you like, to that kind of politicisation, that kind of culture war activity. I mean, there is obviously a great deal of opportunism in the way that universities are swept up, I think, in public discourse, by politicians, within the media. They are, in some ways, very soft, very easy targets. In Australia, they're still predominantly publicly funded, which means that if you like, media, members of the public believe that they do have a right to provide commentary on what universities do and how they behave. Yes, a part of the context is undoubtedly American, and there's a whole history of that, I guess, going back to the 1960s and to the sort of culture wars of the 1980s and 90s, and I guess we tend to sort of just follow on behind, don't we, by a few years. Takes a slightly different complexion in different places. Having politics within universities is not to be bemoaned. It's kind of, it comes with life. Any large institution that's dealing with resources and ideas and people is going to have politics, and to bemoan that seems to be absurd. But obviously those of us who work in universities do need to have strategies for creating spaces, relatively autonomous spaces, where we can actually conduct debates, where we can do research, where we have the freedom to teach in ways that aren't simply, kind of determined, I guess, by those highly politicised culture wars. Yeah.
Stephen Matchett, what you say there is defending a millennia-old culture, which now sits, if not in contradiction, but it sits unequally with a new massified culture, which is universities are almost now about industry policy. They are about providing skilled workforces, and there is no room, or there's less room, in that combined space to do the sorts of things you're talking about. Rightly or wrongly, the broadly defined community think they have a say and think they have a controlling interest. With the percentage of young people now going to university, where we'll be in 20 years' time, we're like in schools. Everyone's got an opinion on schools because everyone went to one, and it's going to happen in higher ed. And it's a tension that you're going to have to navigate.
Yeah, and I mean, there's always, I mean, Glyn Davis has made the point that the universities have always in Australia had that kind of Janus face, haven't they? There was a strong emphasis on professional training in the 19th century Australian university. They were elite universities, but, you know, they were an adaptation, really, of Oxbridge models that really gestured towards some of the newer universities that were emerging in Britain in the 19th century with their emphasis on training, you know, lawyers, doctors, teachers and so on. So that's always been there. But you're right, Stephen, the sheer scale, the commercialisation that Michelle was referring to. The basic model, I think, is critical in the whole issue of social life. The financial model is really important here. I mean, we all know that, you know, international student fees have become absolutely critical to the ways universities operate. They use them to cross-subsidise a whole range of other activities, particularly research. And again, intuitively, most members of the public are uncomfortable with that kind of model. They do not see chasing international student fees as the core business of Australian universities, and yet the universities have effectively been landed with a model that gives them very little choice in the matter. So I think that's a part of the issue too.
That's something I want to ask Phil Honeywell about this afternoon, because it seems to me that reflects a failure of the higher education community to explain what international students do. I still get correspondence of people telling me, but, international students take away places from Australians. I don't know how long you've got to keep telling people that. I mean, the sector's been telling them for 40 years, but it's just simply not true. People still believe it. And there is unquestionably an element of, you know, outright racism there, no doubt. And utter confusion. The line that somehow or another international students are knocking off all the inner city apartments, it has standing in about 4 seats, 2 in Sydney, 2 in Melbourne, federal seats, and one, funnily enough, in Adelaide. Otherwise, it's just complete nonsense. And yet, the sector as a whole, or the sector's lobbies, have not confronted that. I'm going to shut up now.
Jodie, you've landed in your new gig. Did you say the other day, it's 4 months in? Or
9 now.
9 months, but probably feels like 4. Now you've worked in the sector before, but now you're working with the Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Tell us what you've seen, because the intersection between universities and business has been a significant issue for some time.
Yeah, that's right. So it's actually been a really fascinating transition. I worked as an academic for a long time. I then went into policy working for Universities Australia. And as Tim said, I've now been at ACCI for about 9 months. And one of the things that struck me immediately as I started interacting with particularly political advisors in my new role, many of whom I hadn't met in my previous role, was, and this is horrifying, how many of them said to me up front, nobody's going to listen to universities. Nobody likes universities. It was devastating. It was really difficult. And the reason that they were saying that was, I think, not because of the work that goes on in universities. I think it's a perception problem. And I think that both Stephen and in fact the entire panel at this point have really touched on the tension between what we see of universities and what it means to be in academia, which are not actually the same thing at all. And so when we look at academia, which is this millennia-old profession, we have academics who have an affiliation and a loyalty to that profession, and who essentially operate as sole traders, really, within a larger conglomerate, almost like eBay. We have the platform that covers the different activities, but really the eBay sellers are there for their own agenda. And so academics are really there, not just for their own agenda, but for their profession and also for their specific discipline. And so I think that when we talk about academia and universities having a perception problem and having a PR problem, a lot of what we're seeing there is because of the way that that millennia-old system is actually set up. Because we have a system that is designed so that you can find your fellow disciplinarians as an academic. And in order to do that, you have to learn to speak the language of your discipline. And if you don't learn to speak the language of your discipline and do it well, you won't be accepted, you won't be listened to, your papers won't be read, your conference presentations will be shot down in flames. So you are very motivated to get on board with the language of your discipline. And then when you are, well disciplined into your discipline, and then are expected to speak to the public about what it is you do, you have the curse of knowledge. You are thinking in the language of your discipline, and you're thinking about the ideas that by that point feel really obvious to you. But the way that you've been taught to speak is deliberately exclusionary. Jargon is deliberately exclusionary. It's there so that other people can recognise that you're part of the club. But the Australian public, I think, feels like they're not part of the club. And so it's no wonder, I guess, that in fact when academics speak publicly and try and communicate their ideas, that the public feel that they're not being included in that knowledge journey. And so I think that that is part of the problem, that when the public wants to engage, and in Australia apparently we have some of the highest trust in universities and scientists in the world, but when it comes to actual conversations with individuals or hearing from academics, they feel like they're not being included in the conversation. And so I think that then when we look at that and we look at the sorts of things that I've been hearing from my members and the sorts of things that I've been hearing from political advisors around universities, the kinds of things I'm hearing are that they're very difficult to access, they don't live in the real world, they don't want to engage with the public. And because I've worked with universities and in universities for a long time, I know that that's all rubbish, absolute rubbish. And I know that the sorts of things that I'm hearing from members, such as that standards in universities are decreasing, or that the levels of academic rigour are decreasing, I know that that's actually not true. And in fact, the level of compliance that is required of academics in order to ensure that that's not true is enormous. And therefore, it's actually almost absurd to think that we could have declined, other than perhaps to say that there is so much compliance and regulation burden that less time gets to go to teaching. And that may well be true. But nonetheless, Australia has a world-class academic system, and that's for a reason, and a good reason. So I guess just to round that out, in terms of what I think of the things I'm kind of hearing, both from my members and politically, I think that the problem there is a mismatch in communication a lot of the time. And I think that there are ways that both individual academics, should they so wish, can retrain themselves in the language of the public to be able to talk about their research and talk about their teaching in ways that include rather than exclude. But it's a really difficult thing to do, and it requires practice, just in the same way that practice had to happen as you were learning the language of your discipline. And I think also that in producing an accessible front door for industry, and I think universities are trying very hard to do this, but it's very difficult because of that problem of the sole trader issue, that universities look to outsiders as if they are the same kind of large institution as any other institution, like a school, like a hospital, like a corporation. But actually internally they don't operate that way. at all, and you can't see that from the outside. So I think it's incumbent on universities to recognise that difference in themselves and seek the solutions to how to make themselves more accessible. Maybe it's about putting brokers into faculties who can actually get to know all of the academics in the space and understand their research and teaching, and then that sits as a hierarchical network where you've got somebody at the top and you've got that point of access that industry can reach out to, and then that person can go and talk to their network of brokers. Maybe it's something like that, I don't know. But I do know that in order to really come across this challenge and try to face it, we are going to have to do things differently, both from an industry perspective and from the higher education sector more broadly. And industry wants to work with universities. That's really important to understand. But they do feel that universities are very difficult and that there is no front door. And I think we've got to give them a front door.
Can I ask Michelle Grattan a question coming out of that? Are universities a live political issue? Not just in the, are they a live political issue? Not just in the day-to-day, what the polls say and what the latest stuff up is, but broadly speaking, does the community actually consider what parties think about universities when they go to vote?
Well, look, I don't think that they figure in the top 5 or 8 or even 10 issues probably. Education generally is an issue, probably not a first order issue in this election, but certainly up in the second tier. But of course education embraces a whole lot of things. The government wants to put childcare at the forefront of it. People care a lot about schools, I think, and there's TAFE and whether it's delivering. I do think that looking at this government, childcare has been very much a priority. I think that the minister is focused more on schools than he is on universities. He'd no doubt deny that, but that is my perception. And within his concerns about universities, I think that the whole equity thing, getting disadvantaged people from the western suburbs, etc., there is very much his priority. On the Liberal side, I'm amazed, to be honest, that they don't seem to have any policy at all that I can discern. That the spokeswoman there, Sarah Henderson, seems often more commenting on the media and the ABC and so on than on education. And to the extent over the recent years that the Liberals have been in this debate, it is what they believe the universities are doing that they shouldn't be doing, that they're not allowing certain speakers to appear on campus because of security concerns, that they're mishandling the protesters on the Middle East, and I do think that they had missteps there. But my point on the Liberals is that unless I'm missing it, there does seem a vacuum in their higher education policy. Maybe one of the other panellists has been able to discern it better than I have.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting disjuncture, which again I think you've hinted at, Michelle, between the school as a site of public concern and political concern. I mean, you know, if there's a great big hole in the library roof or the gymnasium roof down at your local high school where your kids go, that tends to engage your interest. But, you know, parents don't seem to be worried in the same way about overcrowded lectures or tutorials that are, you know, approaching 25 and 30 as I'm experiencing now here at the ANU. And I think that is probably one of the failures of our sector, actually, Jodie. I mean, we haven't been great advocates, and I think I saw Andrew Norton on the way in who's made a very interesting point about the last government, actually, Michelle, which was criticised very fiercely, I think, for lack of support of the sector during COVID. Now, there may be an argument to be made, they should have done more or whatever. They also provided $1 billion. And if you were the Liberals coalition and you'd done that and got as little appreciation from the sector as I think they got for that particular decision, it was, yeah, and it was not particularly strictly tied, though, as I understand it, and it was a substantial sum of money at a time when universities were actually able to carry on, for the most part, their operations, including in many instances with international students online, so they were still bringing in income. Now, it seems to me that that wouldn't have been a great encouragement for the coalition to continue to engage in a sympathetic way with universities. I don't normally go around the country advocating the interests of the Liberal Party and Scott Morrison, but let me say that, and I think it is a legitimate point, frankly.
Can I just add to that? Thank you. That one thing that's been forgotten was in 2019 when Dan Tehan was Minister, he met with a group of Vice-Chancellors informally and was so impressed by their pitch for what they could do with more research money. He said, give us the arguments and I'll find you the cash. And out of that came that range of applied research programs. Now, whether that should be going to applied or discovery research is another question, but a bunch of money for applied research programs that Labor didn't oppose and are now operating now. Everyone's paying attention to what the industry minister is doing, but there was a whole bunch of new research commercialisation money in the sector, which I imagine if any Liberal frontbencher now remembered it would wonder, you know, why did we bother? Because they all still hate us. And I think that's a very real point.
Jodie, I've got a couple of thoughts. If the Dutton-led coalition win at the next election, the opposition has said that they will cut deeper than on international students than the Labor Party has. When you look at across the board, it's difficult to see the current model certainly paying for another 1 million students, as the Accord is suggesting will be enrolled by 2050. One of the keys is, where do we go for a new business model at the moment? What's industry thinking about that? Because obviously, in terms of where's the money going to come from, partnership with industry and working out how industry perceives better value from the sector is going to be key.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think, first of all, industry is really keen to be involved in the development of curriculum and work with universities and work with academics on how curriculum can better meet the needs of industry. Now, that's a very controversial thing to say, especially in this room, and I think that there is a job of work to do to find the intersection where industry is going to be welcome in those curriculum discussions. There are good reasons, really important reasons, that university curriculum is independent and that allows it to be politically neutral and allows that teaching to not be captured by corporate interests as well. And so, you know, those perspectives are really, really valid. That said, and I think we've touched on this already, the commercialisation of universities means that we do have a different combination of purposes and visions that's sitting within universities now than we did, say, 50 or 100 years ago. That means that we are largely vocational in universities now, although, of course, the research agenda is still absolutely critical. But if we have a vocational agenda, then, yeah, we do have to be thinking about what kind of jobs and how well prepared students are going to be for those jobs when they graduate. And so industry is really keen to be involved in that, and it's the mechanisms that we put in place, I think, that allow for the independence so that corporate interests aren't capturing that content, while also allowing industry to inform and advise. Lots of universities have those kinds of industry councils or industry advisory groups, and that's really good. But it feels at this point, and again, it's a perception issue, and that's a large part of the problem. But it does feel to industry that that's not going far enough, and that that students aren't well enough prepared, and that when they enter the workforce coming out of university, that they should know more. And actually, more importantly, they should be able to do more, because it is largely about skills, less than it is about knowledge. And we know that universities are largely more about knowledge than about skills. That's one of the perceptions of the difference between the university sector and the skills sector, the vet sector. And so, given that that is a requirement now, that students are coming out with identifiable skills that they have practiced, then we need to be looking at work-integrated learning more carefully so that students have had the opportunity to practice in different contexts before they actually hit the workforce.
I'll respond to that briefly. I mean, I agree with the broad thrust of what you're saying, Jodie. I think it does, though, sometimes lead to some pretty narrow conceptions of what work readiness might mean. I mean, one of those we're still grappling with, and that's job-ready graduates, which was an extremely ill-considered policy, even in terms of its own ostensible objectives. That is to redirect student enrolments from, supposedly non-work-related humanities subjects to, wonderfully work-related other things. And we know that it wasn't backed by actual research about the usefulness of, or even the earnings of graduates in humanities and social sciences, which are about the same, I think, as science graduates. It certainly didn't redirect enrolments in the larger, certainly group of 8 universities. I'm unaware of the broader picture, but I can assure you that there's no evidence of its local effects here. But it is saddling students with very high debts. Students in those humanities subjects who are now, well, they will be paying, I think, $16,000 a year under the regime recently, 20 now. So, very, very large sums of money. So, I think I agree about work readiness up to a point. I'm not sure I agree with the sort of skills knowledge division, because I think, in a way, knowledge is the ability to apply what you understand to real-world situations. I mean, that's a part of, it's what I do an arcane thing called history, and I'd like to think that, I'm sitting here at least able to say something that's kind of coherent, if not worth listening to. But, I think that we need a broad sense of what work readiness might actually mean, and what preparing students for the future workforce might entail, because predicting the skills that are going to be needed and the capacities that are going to be needed even 5 years down the track is not easy. We're dealing, my 19-year-old daughter's in her, second or third week at the University of Canberra, I might add. And she's facing now, decades in the workforce. I mean, you'd be pretty brave if you reckon you could predict precisely the kinds of skills she's going to need as an occupational therapist in 20, 30, 40 years' time, which are 50 years' time potentially. Yeah.
2013, 2023, broadly defined humanities and starting enrolments were down 13%.
Right, okay.
The overall system was down around 4%.
Yeah.
It is no disrespect to what you're arguing, which, as I said before, is 1,000 years old.
Yeah.
So just what you're selling, lot smaller numbers of people are buying.
Yeah.
Largely due to the sheer explosion of alternatives.
Yes, yeah, I think
but
that's right.
nevertheless,
Yeah.
people are not buying it.
Yeah.
How do you answer that?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that decline in enrolments, I think, has been possibly even more dramatic in the United States and Britain. So, it's obviously been driven by a range of complex factors. I think, yes, the offerings, student perceptions, parent perceptions, not sure about employer perceptions, but certainly we have to keep, in the humanities, we have to keep making the case that the kinds of education we offer is an adaptable education. It's something that students will be able to use in a range of situations they're likely to face across a long life as citizens and across a long life as workers and employees as well, or as running a business or whatever they're doing.
I think at the moment we are seeing quite a lot of young people who are coming out of school just thinking life is easier and they can make more money, by just working. And of course, in a strong labour market, that is an option. Also, the fact that a lot of them have, even in their last school years, started to work. I mean, the universities are competing with the pool of immediate income, and quite reasonable income, when it comes to attracting people into them. And I think that maybe there's been a change with the current generation compared to a generation or two before. Can I just double back though on a point that Jodie made about standards? You're saying that there's been no fall in standards. I must say that academics that I've come across in the last few years have said that with the whole commercialisation of the sector, and particularly the reliance on foreign students, that they are under pressure to lower standards, to pass people that in previous times would not have been passed. So I do think this question of standards and how that intersects with reliance on the commercial factors involved is an important one. I mean, Frank, you're at the sharp end of this. Maybe you can provide some elaboration.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly haven't noticed a decline in what you'd call standards, but I, admit I'm in an elite university here in Canberra. I have noticed a dramatic decline in engagement. You go along now to, week one, and, if 30 of students are sitting in a lecture, you're doing pretty well. So you can't really be blamed for, having given a pile of dull lectures if it's week one. Maybe they've heard from previous years, I don't know. But I think that there are issues around engagement. I think the reasons for that are probably complex. Part of it may be the modes in which we still teach, which I think are driven by tradition, they're driven by economics, may not be suited to many of our students. I think COVID had dramatic effects, actually.
And they're working more.
And the economic, they're working more. Again, my daughter, 2 days a week she works. So, beginning and end of each week. So she has to concentrate her studies in those other days. And I think that is also a major factor for students. Yeah.
Do we have any questions from the floor as we're moving along? If you can put up your hand if you've got a question, then we'll get to you. I wanted to just raise the issue of VC pay. It's constantly in the news. There's not a simple answer to any of it. How much of an issue is it for people, or is it just an easy point? Michelle?
Can it be both?
I think it is an issue. It's an issue when people have become more critical of universities for a range of reasons, and when universities behave like businesses, they're sort of judged like businesses, and so the Vice-Chancellors are judged against other executives. But for ordinary people, I think that it just adds to the questioning of universities, which was less in the past. And it would be interesting to go back and look at the comparative pay of VCs in the past. I presume it was much, much less.
Yeah, I mean, it's that famous Australian concept of the pub test, isn't it? I mean, again, your average punter looks at a VC salary which could be up around 1.5 million. They see something that's approaching, double what a Prime Minister gets. And, it doesn't add up to them. It doesn't conform to their understanding of what the leadership of a public institution such as a university providing education should be. Look, I spent a year at Cambridge in 97, 98, and at that stage they just had their first executive vice-chancellor. I think he was still in post. So a university of that fame and quality, hadn't had a full-on, if you like, executive vice-chancellor up to that point in the 1990s. It was basically something that circulated between the college heads. So I think there is a scepticism about the amounts. I think there's a scepticism perhaps even about what the role is. And again, you know, I just can't emphasise enough how important COVID was to changing internal politics of universities, I think external perceptions. You know, there was a kind of sense, well, you know, the universities got on with the job, but how much did it actually owe to university leadership? Now, I don't have the answer to that, but I was a head of school at the time, and I have to say that if I had to choose between those above me and those below me who were the more dispensable, I wouldn't have had any difficulty making that decision.
It's a political own goal. It's a political own goal by the university chancellors collectively. They could have shut this debate down before it started by saying, yes, we're going to have a code, we're going to have KPIs, we're going to invite all universities to adopt them, and that vice chancellors should meet them. And we'll have very many hard things to say for those who don't. If they'd done that 4 or 5 years ago, this never would have happened. It is simple as that. And if anybody thinks running a university is simple, imagine what it's going to be like for whoever gets the job running the new Adelaide University. The biggest education institution, I think, in the country. The first amalgamation of its kind, far bigger than anything Dawkins did. It's going to be really hard to do, not least because it's in Adelaide. Because the one thing about Adelaide is that when international students hear of South Australia, they think of everything south of Darwin. It's a huge job. And it's going to cost a lot of money to get someone who can do it properly. They'll probably come from overseas, perhaps. But this is an easy populist political issue which the chancellors should have put away before it started.
Running that university wouldn't be twice as hard as running the country, though, would it?
Different. You go into politics for different reasons. And I noticed that the Senator Lambie wants to tie it to the salary of the Treasurer.
I think that the mechanism that is creating the rhetoric around international students is the same mechanism that is creating the rhetoric around Vice-Chancellor salaries. And I think, in fact, it's not just universities. I think the same kind of rhetoric happens around what politicians get paid. And really what we're looking at there is, are we talking about public institutions or not? And the answer is yes. And the answer is no. Because yes, they're public institutions. About half of the funding for public universities comes from the public purse, and the other half doesn't. And so really, we don't know as a public who we're actually talking about, but we have a feeling that a public institution by name shouldn't have such high salaries because that's not fair, and that this is money that's coming from us, even though only half of it is coming from us. So again, it's that PR issue that, and I agree with you, I think it's something that could have been knocked on the head, but if you knocked it on the head, how do you find the people who actually have that level of complexity in their skill set that is going to be able to run something that is kind of a corporation and is also kind of not a corporation at all, with a whole range of people who consider themselves sole traders? I think that's an incredibly difficult skill set to find.
Yeah. Agree entirely. The only way possible is bonuses tied to actual performance indicators, but very hard to do. But the model for how to get around that sort of question is already out there, and that's the medical establishment. No one ever complains about what a surgeon gets paid, and if they know who runs their local hospital network, they don't worry about that either. To a large extent, that's because a cure for cancer is an argument that's very hard to fight. But equally, there is a level of respect for the medical profession that far exceeds anything else in the country. I don't know how the broadly defined academics can meet that, but I'd suggest that's probably the way they're going to have to go.
Can I ask a question of each of you now, as we're thinking about success factors? What looks like success if you're in Middle Australia? What's going to change the dial, change the dynamic for university? So if we think of it from the outside-in perspective, how do we actually start to meet community on their terms and say, actually, we're doing a pretty good job? Jodie, do you want to kick us off?
That is a tricky one because I think we're talking, again, about two different things. I'm an anthropologist, so the answer is it depends. So the the challenge there is that when you're looking at success factors, you don't get the opportunity to complain. And so when we look at the employer graduate outcome surveys and the results that come out of that research, we see that largely in those studies, employers are really happy with graduate outcomes. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily feel good or it doesn't help you if you're getting out and saying, oh, I'm really happy about the graduate outcomes, because then you wouldn't continue to see improvement, and also you wouldn't be matching your peers in what they're saying, because nobody's saying it. And so what a success factor looks like may well be different to what a reality actually looks like, and that's a challenge. I think also that when we're looking at what Middle Australia wants to see, largely we're talking about what mums and dads want to see for their kids, and what they want to see for their kids is success and well-being that exceeds their own. And there's a lot more to that than just whether or not they've attended university or whether they are educated. There's much more to do with the broader economy, productivity. There's a whole range of factors in that universities can't control. So that's not a very helpful answer. It doesn't actually solve anything, but I think I guess the point I'm trying to make is that success may not actually be visible to us when it occurs.
Frank, any thoughts on how we win?
Yeah, look, I mean, I hope I haven't painted too bleak a picture of where I think universities are now. I think the point Jodie made earlier is a good one. It's a pretty good sector, actually, and doing a lot of very good things. You know, every time I turn on the radio, for instance, there is an expert there, often on an area far distant from my own interest. It could be astronomy, or it could be, possums. It could be anything, and there's a lot of expertise out there which is being communicated in quite effective ways to those who are paying for that research. There's obviously a lot of very good education also happening. It's a successful export sector, as Michelle said earlier. So, I think there's a lot there to celebrate already. I think we'll see success when we'll recognise success when we see it on our campuses, actually. I think one of the alarming things for many of us has been the decline of the campus, really, as a place of life, of debate, of liveliness, I suppose, is the best word I can use for that. And that worries me. I think that universities need to be rooted in place, and we need to do more to restore that sort of sense of a university, as I said earlier, as a kind of participant in civil society, as a cultural institution. We probably need to think of new ways in which those facilities can be made to work for new cohorts of people. I mean, you can go onto this campus here at ANU, for instance, and between November and February, you could shoot a gun in the middle of, I'm not advocating this, but in the middle of the pathway, you wouldn't hit anyone, right? Because there's no one around. So it's clear that we have facilities, for instance, and capacities that aren't being fully utilised and could be made to work, I think, for Australian society in a much more ambitious way than we're attempting at the moment.
Well, just to add to Frank's point, I mean, I do think that we saw in COVID that our higher education sector was seen as a success when experts came into their own and people had a great deal of respect for those experts, perhaps until they started arguing among themselves, but that's another story. So we shouldn't play down the degree to which there's success. But in terms of people judging that broader success, I think it will depend on who you are making that judgment. Business will make its judgments on certain criteria. Overseas potential students will have other criteria, and those looking for the intellectual integrity of the sector of higher education, another set of KPIs as well. So it's a question, I think, with that you have to go to multiple sources to get the answer to.
One last question along a similar vein. Is it a problem that the sector itself has relied so much on Times Higher Ed and other rankings as a de facto demonstration of success, and they're not washing with the public?
They're very methodology driven, aren't they? I mean, I rarely see, to take one example from my own experience, I guess, at the University of London, I almost never see the London School of Economics high on those lists, which is a great revelation, like a great indication, I think, of the problems. One of the greatest institutions in the world but you know, it's not an ordinary multi-faculty university. So their methodology, or they're driven by, you know, whatever the methodology is, and yeah, they can clearly distort internal priorities within universities in terms of where you research. You know, you can try and game the system. You know, constantly being flooded every time. Like, you examine a thesis for University in New Zealand, and you're their best mate next because they want you to answer the QS, survey, in which you'll clearly say that that particular university in New Zealand or wherever is just absolutely fantastic. So it's clearly, has its problems, but I suspect it is also having its effect on student choice internationally. I don't know. I doubt whether it has much impact domestically. Maybe evidence it does. I don't know. But internationally, I suspect it does matter. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that whether it's a problem or not is one question. Whether it's possible to not do it that way is a different question. And the answer to that is, I don't know how else it could be done, because it's a global sector, it's a global industry, and the whole global sector is using it. So there's no way really that I can think of that universities can step away from the ranking system, and we're all part of it. Academics have to buy into it, and international students definitely buy into it, and therefore universities have to buy into it, because they need the international students to come so that the revenue can come, and also so that they can have the lively campuses and have everybody coming onto campus. And that can't happen if you're not well ranked, and if you're not well ranked, then you're not attracting international staff as well, and so therefore you're not getting further up in the rankings. It's all tied together, and so if you're not part of that, then you lose out. But at the same time, it has very little, as you said, Frank, it has very little bearing on the domestic mindset at all. They don't care a jot what level you are in your international rankings, and so it looks like further academic thinking about things. I was going to use a word that I shouldn't, and I won't, but I would never do that. Ways of thinking about things that aren't as important as perhaps the university thinks that they are, and in fact, largely, most people in universities aren't that invested in them either. They just know that there's no way of getting around them.
I don't agree with that. They hate them. They just absolutely hate them. I've spent years dealing with angry people sending me pieces, or deeply methodologically written, about why the rankings are terrible. Yeah. All I would add to that is that the group of 8 celebrate their scores in the Times Higher and QS rankings to the skies. And not many of them often mention how they went in that year's quality indicators in learning and teaching. If international students looked at the University of Melbourne scores in the depth of the pandemic and found that internationals were down to the low 40s in overall satisfaction. I'm not going to say that, like you. I'm not going to say that. They are a problem for the sector. The other point worth making about rankings is that it is a factor of size. The most popular institutions in Australia are very small, and they're often in the private sector, and they're popular because they are small. They engage with their students. There's a jazz college in Brisbane which has these stratospheric scores year in, year out, and it's probably got 11 students, and they just love it. It ain't a model for ANU, but it is one, if you could do it, that would make students happy.
One hand there, and then we will have to finish up this session, but yes, thank you.
Hi there. So I've just got a quick question. You talked a lot about, at the beginning, skills and knowledge, skills versus knowledge, applied knowledge, and you also talked about the potential there is in universities and aspirations, and I really like the example at ANU where it's quiet between November and Feb. What skills and knowledge do you think are missing in universities that they need that could enable them to achieve those types of aspirations? Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. So I actually think that the key there isn't knowledge or skills, it's practice. Because actually I think largely, and to differing degrees across different types of universities as well, but largely universities are just as much in the business of providing skills as the vet sector is. They're just a different type of skills. That's not the perception of the public, and that's important, but I think that's the case. So it's not so much that there's something missing in terms of the knowledge and skills being provided in universities. It's more that I think there are more opportunities for students to be able to practice those skills, and that can be at a really, safe space within the university where they're practicing in I've lost the word, where you're practicing in say your lecturer is pretending to be a business person and you've got the whole class there offering solutions, things like that. So you've got a safe space and they still get to practice. Then you can level up to having an industry person come into the university and practice, and then you go to work integrated learning. I think practice is the key.
Sure. Sorry. Not for students, I mean for staff. What are we missing at the staff level that's stopping us from being able to be bigger than we are, to actually win, as you put it, Tim?
Might have to have a 20-second response.
I think, well, I'd just very briefly say, I think the structure of rewards and perhaps also our professional training probably doesn't prepare us for a lot of the things we have to do. I heard one of my former deans, a very good friend, say that when she became the dean of a very big public university interstate before she came to ANU, learning how to ask people for money, philanthropists for money, was something that she just was not prepared for. She had to go out and train to do that as a dean, and I think that tells us that there are a lot of skills that you kind of need these days that you don't get by osmosis, doing a PhD and spending 5 or 10 or whatever years in the sector. I think we probably do need to rethink some of those issues around training at perhaps at PhD, but also later when people are, like professional development, I guess, once you're an academic. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle Grattan, Jodie Trembath and Frank Bongiorno. It's been a fabulous discussion. For a round of applause for the panel. Thank you.